We are here with the history of video game industry in Chicago, and we have a very, very impressive panel here today. Myself, I am Doc Mack of the Galloping Ghost Arcade. We're actually the largest...
You can start over.
Sorry. Yeah, thank you. Thanks for staying, everybody. We've got a great panel here today for the history of the video game industry here in Chicago. It's been, over the years, just so many amazing video games made here. Myself, I'm Doc Mack. I'm the owner of the Galloping Ghost Arcade, which is the largest arcade in the world. We have over 500 games and cover every type of genre game that's been out there. We've been very fortunate to have a lot of games created by many of the people here on our panel today. They've got so many amazing stories about what it was like creating these games and making these games, and it all took place right here in Chicago. Myself, I also own Galloping Ghost Production, which is a game development company. We've been around since 1994. We currently have 4 arcade games in production, so it's been great hearing stories from these guys and what they went through in making games. So let's start off first. Let's have everybody introduce yourselves, please.
Hi, my name is Colin. I'm a game designer, artist, animator, game designer, started back in 1982 for Bally Midway. And through the 80s were probably my best known arcade games like Rampage and Xenophobe, and worked on games like Spy Hunter and Discs of Tron, and pretty much got to touch. It was a great time to get in the industry, and I have already started talking, and I'm only supposed to be introducing myself. I'm going to turn it over to Jeff.
Thank you, Brian. I'm Jeff Lee. I pretty much grew up in this area, and in college years worked across the street from D. Gottlieb and Company, and years later I ended up working there. Started in 1981 when they commenced their video game division. They, of course, were a pinball manufacturer, and worked on a lot of the early games there, the most famous being Qbert, and a few others that had some acclaim, and some that are pretty much entirely unknown.
Good. I'm Josh Tsui. I'm the president of Robomodo. I've been making games here in Chicago since 92, 93, something like that. Started at Midway Games back in the day. Have gone through just about, it's like 3 other studios here in Chicago. I can't seem to get out of this town. And I've worked on everything from the Mortal Kombat series to Fight Night to currently the Tony Hawk series.
Marty Goldberg. I'm the little guy on this esteemed panel. I'm from your suburb just north of here, Milwaukee. I'm basically a professional historian and archivist. I grew up playing a lot of the games that these guys created, and I try to preserve the information and the history of much of this industry and all the great work that these guys did.
Hi, I'm a surprise guest. I'm Daniel Pesina. I worked on the video game Mortal Kombat. Everything physical on the game is my ideas. So, yeah.
So again, at the arcade, we often run events, and again, we've heard so many great stories about the development of games like Rampage and Qbert and Narc and Mortal Kombat. But even before that, Chicago had such a strong hold on what made arcade gaming and video gaming so strong and popular. So let's, Marty, can you tell us a little bit about the earlier days?
The earlier days. Well, as far as pre-video, I mean, obviously Chicago was the mecca of the coin industry. It was basically here and out east. And it went through a bunch of trials and tribulations in the 50s and 60s, mainly because a lot of the people that had been founding this industry were passing on or retiring and moving on. There was also a lot of legalities that started happening as well, which a lot of you will be familiar with in general, which is the idea that games it even extends into video games for some too. The idea that they're games of chance and not skill, which I find personally BS, but it's this idea that they can be used for gambling. So for a time, yes, there were machines that would pay out money and things like that. Those were considered illegitimate. But even the ones that didn't, they were seen by people in the government as games that could be used for gambling and organized crime. It's something we even face today in some things. Like, I'm part of a show called the Midwest Gaming Classic up in Milwaukee, and we had to stop a lot of our competitions on pinball and arcade and make them completely free competitions because the state has various laws still on the books that still views these types of games as purely games of chance and not skill. So that was a tribulation that even for something like a major company like Bally, where they had problems shipping products, different games to different areas if it was illegal in that state or illegal in a city in that state. So then what you had was in the late 60s, you had kind of a renaissance of coin entertainment, which is when you had a lot of the alternative games like edutainment start to appear, like Computer Quiz and IQ Quiz, which was actually made out of Milwaukee, Dave Nutting's company. Dave Nutting, if you're not familiar, he's the one that actually, him and his group left and became one of Bally's main research arms. They did the first microprocessor-based arcade video game, Gunfighter, which was a license from Taito. So you have this renaissance where these types of games were opening things up for the industry. It was kind of a perfect storm, if you will, because at that same time then you had things happening out on the West Coast involving video games, and video games coming into the arcade, which you famously had Nolan Bushnell and Ted Dabney, who did Computer Space for Bill Nutting's group, Nutting Associates. They left soon after that, and there's another tie into Chicago here. They signed a development contract. They were starting an engineering firm, and they signed a development contract with Bally Midway to develop a video game for them. It was originally supposed to be a hockey-type game with crowds and other things going on, and basically they started Al Alcorn out famously with just trying to duplicate what he had seen, what Nolan had seen in a demonstration of the first video game console, the Magnavox Odyssey. They had a tennis game on there. That became Pong. Bally actually paid for the development of that game. In return, they basically didn't get that game because they turned it down. They didn't believe the earnings that were being reported in the field tests. So eventually they got a game that they released called Asteroid. Yes, without the S, just Asteroid. It was a clone of Atari's second game called Space Race. But it did well enough that at the same time when the Pong craze was starting out, and you had a lot of the companies, most of the Chicago companies started filing suit with it. Chicago Coin was another major company here. They eventually became Stern Electronics. Basically, all the local companies started following suit and getting into video games. Which, keep in mind, at that time, from a legal perspective, pretty much everything was patents, because you didn't really have trademarks and copyrights back then. Everything was hardware-based. There wasn't any software or anything that was being put out. So you were basically patenting the design of this hardware that was the full game. Most of the game developers were engineers. They were electrical engineers. They were being asked to create fun for the first time, which you don't think about with electrical engineers. So it's pretty interesting, but it started opening it up, and then you basically had for a time, for much of the 70s, a lot of the games being put out, some were innovative, but a lot were copies of earlier what are called EM games, or electromechanical games, which are actually that alternative entertainment that I was talking about that really started taking off in the late 60s too. So games like Missile Command, you had, Midway had a game called Sammy that was very similar to that. Where you actually were shooting down missiles that were coming overhead with your own anti-missile missiles. And there were Lunar Lander was another one, had its own similar game in electromechanical format. And then basically you started getting into more of what's called the golden age in the late 70s. So during the late 70s, you had games, obviously Space Invader kicked things off as far as what's considered the golden age, but what you also had from a coin perspective was this opening of who was operating video games, coin-operated video games. really expanding the demand. So in the coin industry, which is separate from the consumer industry, which I can't state enough, there wasn't a quote-unquote video game industry at that time. It's more of an idea that you had these multiple industries that had video games in them. This whole unified idea didn't really come about until later on, but it's this concept in the coin industry. The players aren't necessarily the customers, it's the people that you're selling the games to, okay, which is very important, whether it's distributor or the end operator. And from like 78 until 82, 83, you had this explosion of what were called non-traditional operators. And that's really when you have the golden age of a lot of these Chicago coin companies that really shifted focus more towards video games than traditional games like pinball or EM games and things like that. So that's when you had, and as somebody who grew up during that time, that's when you could walk down a block and find a coin op at a gas station, at your doctor's office, at the airport, at every local restaurant. I mean, everywhere you went, there they were. And then that kind of went away and imploded. Part of the idea being that, well, if you're a doctor, that's great, you're earning that money to begin with, but then you come to the cold realization, well, I've got to get a new game, X amount of months later, otherwise I'm not going to keep earning money. So then what happens is you have those non-traditional operators that explode the markets start to shrink, and then you have what happened with the coin industry that time, with which these guys, some of these guys can inform you with better than I could because they lived through it. This condensing of the industry in a lot of that coin. But that's basically a summation of everything pre these guys. So
yeah. Well, and let's Brian, like you two had so much to do with creating so many iconic characters that made people buy games, and people had to go to arcades to go try your creations. Can you tell us a little bit about it?
Well, you made a tremendous point there too, is right before we came in to the industry, the management was selling coin operated games and engineers were doing the design.
And they were operating factories.
Right.
They had workers, they had to feed the factory. That was,
you're late with a game, you don't hit a deadline, people get laid off. And that was kind of coming into the industry. I came from a film background. I was an animator, pen and ink guy, and had a lot of fun. But coming in, they said, hey, I thought I was answering an ad to do pinball back class. That's cool. They said, no, you're going to be animating video games like Pac-Man. And I went, oh, that's going to be real nice, yeah. But, I thought childhood was over because I got a paying job, and, I was dead wrong. Childhood has continued ever since. But who we were designing for was now two audiences, very distinct audiences with very distinct. Player wants to live forever on a quarter. The operator wants him off in 30 seconds, and we had to make both of them happy. And it was a time. It was a magical time at early Midway. It was, one big happy. One big family where everybody in the development group, management didn't quite know what they were doing yet. We didn't quite know what we were doing, but they let us do it. And they let us play, and they gave us a box, and we pushed against it and pushed it against it, and it was a wonderful time. We were making iconic things just because no one had tried before, and that was the early Midway, pre-1989, was a wonderful, wonderful time to fall into becoming a game designer.
Yeah, my experience was kind of similar. I was an artist, worked in animation, but I was hired out of the box for the video game division. Gottlieb being a pinball manufacturer, they wanted to jump on this bandwagon and produce video games to feed the factory. Howie Rubin was our VP, and Ron Waxman was the head of video engineering. They hired all the staff. The programmers were given pretty much absolute freedom. It was assumed, if you could program a game, you could design a video game.
Would it be fair to say you became a designer out of self-defense?
Well, I had always been a gamer. I played board games, card games, and at the time when I was hired there, I was very active, role-playing games and all that kind of stuff. So this was perfect for me. I immediately set around to designing games as well as the graphics, which was, my function there. But it's much like you described. We were exploring some unknown territory to a large degree. Obviously, there were models out there, given the Atari's earliest success and a lot of things out of Japan. In fact, our company initially licensed a few products, waiting for us, the homegrown group to come up with things.
We were the transition from programming engineering, especially in the early days. In the retelling now is funny, but I'd been working there a few months. Discitron was one of the first thing I worked on. And just to bring animation, they were loving it. And then I was informed that a big secret got busted, that we didn't just have one palette of 16 colors, we had 4, but the guy who was in charge of the department, the programmer who was in charge of the department, didn't want to tell the artists that they had 4 palettes of 16 colors, because then they just want to use them. And how many colors do you need anyway?
16?
Yeah,
still happens.
In hindsight, and again, we were pushing. It was people ask about playing games and, were you a gamer? How'd you break into it wasn't an industry that it was a job I stumbled into. And I didn't not think of it as being the center of the universe the way it's thought of now.
It was, I think most of my colleagues were local people.
Yeah, oh yeah, everybody.
One of our engineers, I saw him recently for the first time in a long time, David Bonecutter. We were asking him how he got his start, and it was like he was in high school, riding around his neighborhood, and Midway, I think it was Midway, had some plant or warehouse or something nearby, and he used to dumpster dive there and come away with all these boards. He came from a very poor background, and he was just thrilled. He would take these things home and then kind of reverse engineer them and build stuff or sell them, and just a local kid.
Yeah. It was a great time. It's a great time.
And it's been one that's constantly evolving, and so much innovation has come through the industry, and it's even now ever expanding. In the 90s, though, as things changed up, the games became bigger and more involved and more elaborate. Josh, can you tell us a little bit about the 90s?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. So I started around, in the early 90s, and ironically, my first interview at Midway was at the Williams part of Midway.
After they bought us.
Yeah, and so and I interviewed also to do the LED animations, and I sucked at it. It was terrible. So I interviewed 9 times over the course of a year before I got hired, and it was. So in the 90s, what happened, at least from my perspective, is that over at Midway there was a shift in the way games were being made. Before I got there, they had success with the first Mortal Kombat had just been released, and the way the technique that they used to create the sprites and everything coming from NARC and NBA Jam and Mortal Kombat changed the way they were hiring for people on the game teams. And so at that time, Jack Hager, who was one of the main guys that was running the department, the video game department, he was basically looking for designers and artists that were not the traditional pixel pushers that have been in the industry before, because he wanted to really explore these different types of getting artwork into the game. So I ended up getting hired because I knew how to digitize video. The guys, they were already doing that, but they needed to kind of keep pushing the technology, and I was kind of experimenting with that stuff in college, so I kind of fit in really well. Just like what you said, I got into it completely by accident, and I was super lucky because I got in at a time that I think was the next resurgence of arcade games, which was the mid-90s. Obviously MK, NBA Jam were huge phenomenons. You're talking about billion-dollar franchises, and it's coming out of this small group out here in Chicago. And so, I ended up in this place where there are just legends working there. You got Mark Trammell, Ed Boon, Warren Davis, who also helped create Acuber, was working there. Eugene Jarvis, who's like the godfather of video games, he was still there at the time. And many of these guys were like my childhood heroes, especially Eugene Jarvis. Because Joust and Defender and Robotron and everything. So it's interesting because this was before 3D graphics really started coming in. We started doing these crazy experiments, and I almost like to say that the 90s, at least at Midway, arcade games was a time where we really explored violence like really well. And it was because something was like, wait a second, we can get these actors in here, we can do all kinds of things, we can do things that are almost like movie productions, and being the immature developers that we were, the first thing we went into was violence, of course. It wasn't anything else. It was, all right, let's just go stupid and do violent stuff and make it really funny. And it just hit a niche in there. And so that's why, there's so many fighting games out. But even like a basketball game, Midway did NBA Jam, and Arch Rivals kind of had this too, where you're basically beating each other up as you're playing basketball. And so we found that nice little niche in that, and it worked out really well. And I always joke that, our working conditions, like our first office for the studio was in the back of the pinball factory. We had, we would find like mice in our vending machines. That's how bad it was and stuff. And so the joke was always that, we made these types of games because our conditions were so terrible that we had to invent it somewhere. So we made
live a fantasy life.
Yeah, exactly. And so, but it was great in that. Back then, much like what you're saying, there was almost no management. All they really cared about was, make sure your game is done at this date. You stay in budget. We almost don't care what you make. So it'd be like 4 or 5 people on a team putting the game together, and that creative freedom was amazing. You don't see a whole lot of that in terms of big game companies. I've worked with EA, Microsoft, THQ, and Activision and such, and there's a lot of freedom there. But this was really unique in that it was a very big company. Midway was, at least in the 90s, was, at the top of the food chain, but the level of creativity that they gave to the team was unbelievable. I mean, to this day, I've never seen anything quite like it. And in many ways, that also led to its kind of downfall after the 90s and stuff, because as home games started getting bigger, that type of mentality going into larger scale productions became kind of a problem.
Yeah, Gottlieb had an attitude also. It was like an open office. Bunch of us working in one room. I don't know if it was kind of the same for you guys.
Similar, not one room. My office was a hallway, though.
Right, yeah. And so it was like the Bell Labs model where the janitor is bumping into electrical engineer who's talking to an accountant, and then sometimes something wonderful would grow out of those kind of interactions. It led to some good games for us, and sometimes
it didn't always work every time and stuff, but just the level of exploration that we were able to have was really nice. And I see that in many ways, I see that coming back in terms of the way like indie games are right now. You have smaller groups of people making games that are very expressive. They might hit one particular niche, but they do it very well. And so it's kind of fun to be able to see that coming back.
Yeah. As you had bring up console, like the evolution of it continuing to console-based games, like how did that change your careers in the industry?
After we got Midway, or after Williams bought Midway, my partner Jeff Nauman and I were the only 2 video designers they kept, and we were about 3/4 of the way through Arch Rivals at the time. And we did one more game for them, Pigskin, and then we were kind of wooed away by EA, who said, you want to come work for us? And I said, I like California to visit. Would you, let us work out of house? No, but if you want to form your own company, we'll supply you with the money. So it took me about 6 months to convince Jeff, but we parted on very good terms with the new Williams Bally Midway, but just to keep everything totally clean and above board, we never told EA what we were going to propose. So we basically quit our jobs, got on a train, went across country and went to a room full of people and pitched them the first idea out of the box. Something, that I'd come up with, but to a room full of strangers. And fortunately, they loved it. And that was our first game as a new company was a Sega 16-bit where we kind of pushed the envelope. We did a real-time strategy game with 10 guys on a screen that you're moving your cursor around, you go here. It was called General Chaos. And it was their number one non-licensed game that year. And it kind of put us on the map because we'd done a number of hit arcade games and spent the last 25 years since then just, somebody else taps us on the shoulder and says, hey, can you come do stuff for us? So the shift to home games was just kind of, I wish I could say we planned any of this, but I've always just kind of floated along and been very lucky. But yeah, home games is where we went next, and General Chaos and EA, and trying to do stuff on the small screen, not having the same concerns, that you had in the arcade of how do I get that next quarter out of their pocket, but a lot of that translated into good. You were talking about the factory, the guys on the factory. We didn't get a game done on time. People got laid off. Keeping deadlines, it has helped me forever. Just that kind of stuff you learned early. No, you make good on your promises. You get that game out when you say you're going to get it out. And that made it possible to do, again, smaller games for older systems, especially like Sega. I'm sounding like a broken record, but it was a wonderful time too. It was a wonderful time to do that as well. All right, I'll shut up.
Well, it was a little different for me. Marty talked about the implosion in the industry, and in '84, our Gottlieb was owned by Columbia Pictures, who was in turn owned by Coke, and Coke said, "Sell off this industry. It's just on its way down." So that's what they did. They shut things down. The pinball side of the business actually survived for another 10 years or so. There was a partnership that bought all those assets. They became Premier Electronics. They continued to make pinball games. I myself I continued actually to do like redemption games. I did some other arcade pieces. In fact, one for Premiere was a very strange game called Exterminator. Doc has it at the arcade. A few other things. I only did a few cartridges, did storyboards and other type art because I'm an artist. So eventually I kind of drifted out of the industry entirely, and it's not been until the last few years I got kind of reacquainted with what was going on here. It's just
sucked back.
Amazing to me the enthusiasm, or maybe it's a nostalgia factor. Well, it's depends on the generation. There's nostalgia factor. I think for a lot of guys in their 40s who were teenagers playing our games back then. And then there's a new generation that's, video games have always been part of their life due to home games, consoles, and it's just amazing to me. And then to come here today to this summit and hear all this learned discourse about video game law, it's a revelation. Yeah. So, anyway.
Yeah, I mean, it's, I left Midway, me and a few other people, John Tobias also, had left Midway in '99 kind of because we wanted to work in console games. We had done Midway at the time, all the games were arcade games, and we got to do one Mortal Kombat game that was solely for console, and that was really fun to do. It was just a very different medium, so it felt like we were able to kind of stretch our creative legs quite a bit. It was very different in terms of game design, not having to think about a player dropping a quarter every 30 seconds and such. And so we ended up leaving to form our own company in '99, mainly because we saw consoles getting more and more powerful. I think around that time, the PlayStation 2 was either came out or was about to come out. But we had seen a preview of it at CES in Vegas, and we thought, wow, this is more powerful than the hardware that's in the arcades. So we left. We formed Studio Gigante and did a fighting game for Microsoft for the first Xbox system, and just because it was so powerful, we saw that there was a huge shift in power once these things came out, and obviously consoles have blown up since then, and arcades at that time really started to die out quite a bit, just because people suddenly realized I can play 40 hours of Tomb Raider for $40 as opposed to 50 cents for every 30 seconds or so. So that changed a lot. Game design wise, it's at that time, for some stupid reason, every publisher wanted 40 hours of gameplay, whether it was realistic or not. So you had a lot of games that were designed where it's really about 5 hours of gameplay that's repeated 8 times. It's the same thing that you're doing over. So there was a lot of
job.
Yeah. So it's like a huge learning curve at the time. Luckily, we kind of stuck with fighting games. And fighting games, and Danny can speak a lot about this. Is it's that in arcade and on console. They're not exactly the same, but you can basically have the same game loop, and it's just as satisfying on either system. So that's one of the few genres that kind of translates really well from one to the next. So for me personally, going from arcade to consoles, I've always kind of strayed towards working on games that felt more arcade-like. It's not that I don't like playing games like like longer form games like Skyrim and things like that. It's just that there's no way in hell I'd want to work on something like that because they're so big and so involving. And so that so even like with the skateboarding games that we do now, if when you play them, for the most part they're 2-minute experiences. They're very much arcade-like, and it's kind of like sticking with that stuff.
Well, and I mean, would you? Maybe I'm alone in this, but would you agree that even as impressive as some of these enormous games are, and they are, don't you feel sorry for the people working on them that they don't have that small team experience?
I think so.
I know, tons of kids that over the years that advised how to get in the industry, and they're out there and they're working and they're doing stuff, and they're spending their year doing water for it's they're not in the kind of the small group. Hey, let's try this. Now you're out of your mind. Back and forth.
We went like working on animated film though.
Which I couldn't do. I did animated films that won international awards, but I was the only animator. And the first animated film job I got offered out in New York, I almost wept after I took the 4-hour in-betweening test going, I went to school for this, oh my Lord. Fortunately, Midway offered me the job right after that. So I was able to turn that one down and start at Midway.
I mean, I would say, the thing is that experience is experience. If somebody wants to, let's say coming out of school, if they want to work at a big studio, get the experience, I think it's a great idea, because I always tell people when they ask about how to get into the industry is, take whatever job you can get, knowing that you're not going to stay there forever. Most people are going to switch jobs probably at least 4 times in their life, so they shouldn't think that it's like a marriage you suddenly can't get out of it. Most people get out of their marriages anyways. So the thing is that, it's basically, I always tell people, it's going to work for a big studio is not a bad thing, because what you'll do is you'll go and make every mistake that you would make even if you did it out on your own, but at least you're getting paid for it. You're making mistakes on somebody else's dime. And then you come out of it, and if you want to do your own game, then you have all that experience with you, and you'll make a whole other set of mistakes after that. But at least you're getting paid in the meantime. That's how I always felt about my years at Midway. I was there for almost 7 years, and it just got to a point where I felt like, all right, it's not that I know everything, but I know enough now where I can avoid this set of mistakes, and so I can go on and and just kind of elevate myself a little bit.
And that's a perfect way. All guys are always asking me, new hires especially. It's like, how did you learn all that? How do you know how to do the? I mean, I know I shouldn't do this, but I do my own contracts. But then how did you learn all this? It's like, well, you get bent over a chair this way one time, you won't do that again. And it's the same with everything about making games. Is my big games people know. And that's fun, and it's flattering to hear after 30 years that people still remember this stuff fondly. But some of the most important games I've done are the horrible mistakes that, it's just because I can do something doesn't mean that I should, They're just, you learn as much from the mistakes. You learn more from the mistakes.
Hopefully.
Yeah, hopefully, right.
Well, like when they were filming Mortal Kombat, like, can you tell us a little bit about that? Because you were coming up with so much of that as you went. And ended up with an amazing game that did both great in the arcade and console.
Well, as you were saying before, the industry is so loose about supervision. The first day I went in to shoot the game, I walk into John's office, and John was like, "Hey, how'd you get in?" Because I've known John for a long time. We used to play D&D together. He's like, "How did you get in?" I go, "I came through the back door." He goes, "Wasn't there any security?" I go, "No, there's no security." I was, let's go film this, because it was after hours. It's kind of late. It's gonna be a low budget game, so it was not during like any normal work hours. So he's like, "No, we got to go walk all the way back to the back, and you have to sign in." And I'm like, "Dude, there's nobody there. Why? They won't even know I'm here." And so anyway, it was so loose that, I signed in, and then we get to the area that we're going to start shooting, try to experiment with some moves, and it's just John and I. And we open the door, and we turn on the lights, and it winds up, it's a storage room. So there's no place to even shoot any type of movement. That's how kind of archaic it was, And then we finally cleaned out the storage room, and John pulls out a sheet of paper with punch, kick, elbow, fighting stance. And he's like, "Okay, ready?" And I was like, "Okay, punch." "Well, what kind of punch?" "Well, what kind of punches do you know?" And I'm a martial artist. So I'm like, "Okay, this is a punch for the body, this is a punch for the upper body, this is a punch for the face, this is a punch in case the guy touches this and it turns to this." And then so we started just filming all these moves and moves. We filmed about 8 hours worth of moves. And then John was like, "We can't use any of that." And I was like, "Dude, why?" And he goes, "Because you shot here, but if you moved 1 inch, you were smaller for the next frame, and when you moved back." And then I was like, "Well, what are we gonna do?" He's like, "Well, I can erase all those moves, and we'll just start again, and this time, I'll put a line down." And so he put a line down, but then again, it was just a very experimental, because I would start throwing punches and kicks, but he's like, we shot about 5 hours, and then he called me up the next day. He's like, "Boop," because we used to all call each other Boop. Was that? The group, we call each other Boop. Everybody has the same, Boop, could mean anything. So he's like, "Boop, you got to come back in. We got to shoot everything." He goes, "Why?" He goes, "Well, because you stayed on the line, but when you go forward, the lighting's a little different than when you go backwards. So now I got to set up lights for." So the whole, I would say about 20 hours of the original game, just John and I, were erased because nobody knew what they were doing.
And
we really did not.
And it was all shot on VHS tape, and so
high 8, John's high 8.
Yeah. Because I was telling John about that. He first did VHS, and then they discovered the high 8 stuff.
Yeah.
But he was telling me how they digitized it, and by the time I got there, we went a little bit more digital. We went through a straight digital shoot. But I remember him talking about the high 8 stuff, and how he would have to get on the deck and go frame by frame, and then digitize each one off. There was no tool at the time to properly do it.
Yeah, there wasn't. He was, when I was, the first time I was expected to fall, it was a concrete floor. And he's like, "Okay, you're going to have to fall." And I'm looking at him and then I'm like, "I'm not going to fall, this is concrete." He's like, "Oh, don't worry, we'll get Ed to buy you dinner." And so I was like, because there was really no return on it. I was like, "Oh, he's going to buy me dinner? Okay. I'm going to fall on the floor." So the first couple of times I fell on the floor, he's like, "Well," he goes, "it really, when you fall on the floor, we got to, it glares." So again, we went to that whole thing. Guess what? We got to reshoot. And then I was like, we have to learn. We can't kind of be so barbaric. But it was
pushing
really
the envelope
fun.
sounds easier than it is.
Yeah, and to as you said, sometimes it's about the art, because I recall when John was going to start his own company, he was like, I was like, man, you have it really good here. Why don't you stay? And he was like, you know what? I don't want to be around for Mortal Kombat 10. And this was way back then, and now we have Mortal Kombat 10.
Absolutely, yeah, and I don't know if you're gonna bring it up. I mean, obviously, Danny has played numerous characters, on the Mortal Kombat series and stuff. But if you don't follow him on Twitter, like, you should follow him on Twitter, because he, like, some of the footage that you show, he has actually the original footage of them shooting stuff, and it's fantastic. It's like,
Yeah, it was a good time.
Yeah.
Plus, like they said, no supervision. So we literally got to do anything we wanted. There was nobody around. It was just John and I. Usually, sometimes Ed would pop in to just check on us. He was the boss, kind of, hey, what are you guys doing? Hey, we're working. Okay, you need anything? You want dinner? I was like, okay, order me some.
you got to fall again.
Yeah. Yeah, but he knew how to, he knew how to schmooze and make you happy, and we were just we would just do whatever we wanted to do. And that's it.
Well, and as it evolved even further and the budgets got larger and larger, like, things became more constrictive as far as the games themselves. Like, so many of the artistic ideas were taken away from the artists and the creators of these games, and it evolved more into, we need to do safe things and what we know will work, and it has really changed the industry. And it's great to see it kind of getting back a little bit more to how it used to be with the indie scene.
Right.
So how do you feel the indie gaming scene has continued on?
Well, I mean, from a personal standpoint, like I say, our business plan at Game Refuge has always just been, hey, we're working on what we're working on, and somebody taps us on the shoulder and says, hey, let's do this. So we've done coin-op casino and mobile and Facebook and advert games and a little bit of everything over the years. And for me, it's great. It's a creative challenge every time. But with the advent of the indie scene, what I'm loving is the fact that it's a return to kind of my roots of the smaller game. Because, as you say, and I don't even know if that's a later thing, but at the corporate level, it always has been, like they say in film and everything else, it's like, you come up with a great new idea that no one's ever done before, you would think that they would rush out to do it, and 9 times out of 10 is no. I mean, and that's not new. That's not just because there are 500 people teams and $10 million budgets. It's Rampage was, hey, yeah, this looks great. No, we can't do it. Go over his head. Finally, president's door to get the game done. But the indie scene now is making small games, and I think part of what made it fun for me and makes me feel bad for these guys who get paid a whole lot more than I do working for these big companies, but is the indie scene lets peak creatives push themselves in small teams, and they're shorter games, and they are games that you can play fast. I did the long games, 3 in the morning for months on end till the wife says, either move yourself or the computer out of the bedroom because this can't work anymore. So I enjoy bigger games, but the small games, there's still always going to be a market for someone who just wants to play for a few minutes or play for 20 minutes, a half hour. And the indie scene has let people do that. And let people make smaller, simpler games that amuse you and surprise you in what I think of as the old arcade style, at least my arcade era, the 80s. It's wonderful. Jeez, I do sound like a broker.
Well, that'd certainly be my preference, are smaller, simpler games. But I mean, I know there's market realities that people and corporations have to adhere to, but really what's most fun and creative or pure art is following your passion. What is interesting to you as an exercise in your art. So if you can afford to do that, to me, that's the most gratifying path to take.
Yeah, I'm not sure what that.
Yeah, it's very true, and you have that without the confines of funds, it's kind of during the creative process, you can get something really, really good. And I think you reach a little bump in the road when it has to, come out onto the market. And hence, that's why we're here speaking at, the Video Game Law Summit. Is a lot of the gamers really need to have the support of legal representation. It's otherwise,
There's
tough.
been things that have just over the years that there's been some glaring legal issues within even from everybody that we see at the arcade. It's like there's projects that there's legal questions on. So this has definitely been an informative event and a lot of fun.
Yeah.
Someone asked me yesterday. Was asking about now. Did the people from Godzilla come up to you? Did the people from King Kong come up to you? Were you approached, or anybody within Bally Midway at the time from a corporate level come down and say, okay, these are infringement? And that's why in an earlier session I asked about parody, because I think one of the writers at the time said, "Oh, this is Godzilla meets the Three Stooges," and I said, "You can't say that." and the writer says, "I can, you can't."
We actually did a Three Stooges game at Gottlieb. Our parent company being Columbia, who produced the Three Stooges shorts, and I had advocated, from the time it started, we ought to do a Three Stooges game. And it turns out even there, it wasn't that simple. The people we had to deal with was not our parent company, Columbia, but it was Norman Maurer and Associates, who was Moe's son-in-law, who handled all the business deals, arrangements for the Three Stooges. So we had to clear everything through him. So yeah, there were a lot of hurdles for
licenses
Licensing.
bring their own challenges. We did Star Trek Voyager a few years ago for a group, and the Munsters, and I tend to stay away from them because as an artist like you, it's like I like doing my own thing, and you have nobody to check with. But the licenses have their own challenges, and a lot of times it's as simple as just talking to the right people the right way. We were about to get thrown off the set at the Paramount backlot as we were walking around taking pictures of the Voyager set, and we walk around the corner, and a very angry cigar-chomping LeVar Burton is threatening to, what are you doing here? I don't care, video game, it doesn't make any difference, this is a closed set, and just, exercising his right to, who are these weirdo kids walking around? And the client was with us, he was stammering, I was stammering, and the lead artist on the lead animator said, "LeVar, I loved," and he, the shoal sands of the Kwanzaa zone, wasn't that your directorial debut? I love that one. And immediately fast friends, and we didn't get kicked off. So, it helps to have a well-rounded staff that's got the right way to deal with all the things you might come up with.
Well, unfortunately, we're coming to a close. Is there questions? We can open the floor to questions for.
I wonder if you could talk about surprises that you had along the way. Like Brian, you mentioned you learned from some of your mistakes along the way. Can you think of any games that you were kind of meh about and wow, they went gangbusters in the marketplace? Or on the other side, games where you really had high expectations for them as you were developing them and they kind of fizzled? And if you have a story along those lines, what was a lesson you might have taken out of those experiences?
Boy, last part first is yes, I've had games that I thought were going to be spectacular, and then just maybe 100,000 copies is all they sold, and didn't do what I thought they would do, because who wouldn't play full contact poker on rocket-powered, heavily armed snowmobiles in a racing format in a Cthulhu mythos Arctic world. Why did that not take off? I do not know to this day. I keep trying to talk Doc into doing it into an arcade piece, but so far he hasn't bought. Sometimes, like I said, sometimes you just because you can do something doesn't mean you should. I've been lucky enough that most of my games I design for myself, for my own amusement, and I've been lucky that most of them have resonated with enough other crazy people out in the world that they've become successful. But yeah, there's a few out there, and that's the other wonderful thing about Doc at the Galloping Ghost is he loves to find this didn't get released for a reason, Doc. And you can see them at his arcade. And maybe the only
orphan games.
Yeah, the one that you won't see anywhere else. And he loves to showcase them. Keeps us all humble. Keeps us all humble.
I have a question for Josh. It's about Galloping is the Lotus, but I think you kind of.
Oh my God.
I really like that game. I don't know how well it did, but.
It did well, actually. It did.
Have you done any fighting games since then? And I also have another question just on fighting games in general.
Sure.
When was the decision to let's make moves so cumbersome? Somehow, the way to go, and Street Fighter takes it to even crazy moves. I just kind of curious game design wise.
Yeah. So I'll answer the first question. So after Tao Fang, I ended up working on a WrestleMania game, one of two WrestleMania games that I've done in my career, which is really odd because I never watch wrestling except for when I'm working on a WrestleMania game. And then after that, I worked on Fight Night Round 3. And then after that, when I was still at EA Chicago, we're working on a Marvel fighting game that never got released. You can actually find videos of it online. And so I've done as many fighting games as I've done skateboarding games and the occasional mobile games here and there and such. I love fighting games still to this day. And if I had a chance to do another one, I'd do it instantly. Because like I said, they're one of the few. It's one of the few genres that translates across multiple platforms. In terms of cumbersome moves and things like that, I think it's one of those things where it's evolution. It's like if you don't keep adding new things to it, on each iteration of a franchise or even on a new fighting game, if you don't keep building on top of it, then people are going to get bored. So it's a good and bad thing because it can get so convoluted that it just gets ridiculous after a while. But it's not too different from I talked about the violence in in some of the video games earlier and stuff. You look at Mortal Kombat X and some of the fatalities that they're doing now. A combination of really great technology and the need to top what you've done before. It just kind of you'd have to just keep escalating it. So I'll put it through the lens of being artistic and say that as artists we just want to make sure that we're constantly evolving. But sometimes game design can get stupidly convoluted, but it's one of those things where you just have to kind of make a decision on a per game basis on what you want to do, and then luckily, it's a good and bad thing. Luckily on console games, you can always keep tweaking the games as you're going along, and you can simplify things if you wanted to. Whereas back in the day, after arcade, in the early consoles, you can never get updates to games. What you got was what you got. And a lot of people think of that as good old days, but that actually kind of sucked, So I think nowadays it's actually a lot better where you can get things tweaked on a constant basis.
You guys talk about the current state of the game industry in Chicago?
Not intelligently. I work on what I work on, and that's my life, pretty much.
And as far as other manufacture going on, there's incredible technologies.
Raw Thrills.
Raw Thrills is here.
Jersey Jack, right, is out this way, and Stern. Probably the only 2 pinball manufacturers in the world still out here, because all the pinball guys are still here. In fact, some of our old colleagues are still making pins.
Yep.
That's still a pretty wide range of developers out here. I mean, a lot of people, like we talk about the arcade stuff because we're like old men talking about old stuff. Really, it's, in terms of like newer developers, there's a boatload of indie developers.
Wargamer.
Yeah, and then you got Wargaming, you got NetherRealm, which used to be Midway Games, and and Warner Brothers bought Midway, or at least that part of Midway. And there's quite it's a pretty big variety. You got companies like Iron Galaxy, Phosphor, that you don't know Jack guys. I'm sorry, the new Jackbox Games, and so you have everything from 2-person teams up to giant publisher-owned studios. So it's a pretty healthy town in terms of the range of developers that you have going on. We tend to focus on certain types, certain platforms and stuff, but in general, it's still a pretty healthy town. It's one of the few cities that has that range of development going on.
All this history of gaming in Chicago. Shouldn't someone make a documentary about it?
I think a number of people are.
My check clear, Patrick?
There's a documentary called So You Want to Be a Video Game Designer on the YouTube channel, on the Game Refuge YouTube channel, that guys like interviews with Termel and myself and Jeff Nauman and George Gomez and Jack Hagar and Eugene Jarvis, and
it's a great series. It's a really great series.
It's dated. I mean, it's 15 years old now, but all the principles are still the same, and it's a fun documentary.
And for the record, I engaged in writing a memoir of the Gottlieb enterprise, and in the course of that, we've interviewed a number of our old colleagues, and my collaborator has an idea of making a documentary out of it. At least we're accumulating footage, getting people's memories down, and something on the record. And we've been interviewed by a number of people at these conventions, and they say they're making documentaries.
Well, I am making a documentary, so yes, I have a documentary that's in production right now that's focusing on very specifically Midway Games in the 90s, just because, like I was saying before, it was the game studio in the 90s, not just in Chicago, but just worldwide, just with these giant franchises. And I worked during that era, and I felt like I was witnessing history. So there's all these characters, all these stories going on, and just felt like somebody needed to say it, to tell the story. So basically put that together, got that kickstarted over the summer, talking with quite a few people in this room about it, and hopefully it'll be out 2017.
And I would hope the budding and current game designers keep that in mind, because there's, you're probably taking part in a renaissance or a rebirth of at least the next generation of gaming. So I hope you preserve your history as it unfolds.
Excellent. Any final questions?
A pretty broad question I'm going to ask is, speaking to new game designers and new game developers and state of the industry, I was wondering what your thoughts are about like getting game design and game development in regions of the world in which the industry isn't so prominent, for instance in Africa. And I was wondering if you had some thoughts about like how to encourage and like help grow that industry in those regions, given your experience and the time you've spent in the industry so far. What are your thoughts?
I think that's a little bit,
Broad.
for abroad, it's a little more difficult. I was approached to search out some, man, I'm being filmed. But anyway, that never stopped me. That never stopped me. Of taking some video games that are popular and made in the U.S. and getting them to be skinned by Alibaba. And we ran into a bump in the road because it was generally thought that they would just not pay for the rights and just skin it anyway, without the owner's consent or permission. So I think that as far as like extending it worldwide, right now until we get a universal set of laws that will protect that, that's going to be a little difficult. At least that's been my experience for that.
I would say one thing you could take away is from the old guys is that, you know, my teams on these iconic games were 3-4 person teams, and the time frame to turn around a game, 3 or 4 people, even with the newer games that I'm doing, I can do a game in 3 months with a programmer, a sound guy, and an artist. How that translates specifically to any particular country, the only thing I can say to take away is if you define what you want to do within the realm of what's available to you, that's the beauty of this creative process. I mean, a game can be incredibly fun and have been created in a few months. You just don't try and recreate what Blizzard is doing, but yeah, is to take that element that it is possible to do that with a couple of people. You don't need, and the tools are out there.
Yeah, with the tools today, it's probably more possible to do this in the developing world, assuming you get people with some basic knowledge of how to use these tools. You don't need to build a factory to make games, you know?
I've even learned a couple, so they're not that hard to learn.
Well, we are actually out of time now, unfortunately. I want to thank everybody for being on the panel. And
thank you.
Thank you for having us. Thank you.
Panel for the day. Thank you so much for coming to CVGLS. Can I get another round of applause for all of our speakers and our volunteers?